The Neo-Darwinian theory of evolution is the modern variant of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. The evolution of life throughout the history of Earth, explained by the basic principles suggested by Darwin, variation and natural selection, combined with the insights of modern science, most notably genetics. This theory is widely accepted today as the scientific explanation of the evolution and great diversity of life. But does the theory possess sufficient explanatory power to account for this evolution in all its aspects? When it comes to the question of the nature of reality, man's place in the world, and perhaps even the meaning of life, this is an important issue, as this theory points towards specific answers to those questions. And consequently, should the theory turn out to be less explanatorily powerful than what is perhaps often assumed, this could lead to different perspectives on those questions. Several points of criticism have been raised against the Neo-Darwinian theory of evolution, and in this video I'll take a closer look at them to address the question of the sufficiency of the explanatory power of the theory. Science recognizes a number of different ways for evolution to occur. Usually, natural selection is held as the prevalent one. The hereditary factors that confer greater fitness regarding survival and reproduction tend to increase over those that confer lesser fitness, the proverbial survival of the fittest. Sexual selection is a subset of this. Additional modes for evolution include genetic drift, mutation, and migration. Mutations are random or spontaneous variations in individual genes, while genetic drift is an overall change to a population explained not by adaptation through natural selection, but by changes resulting from randomness or chance. Regardless which modes of evolution are considered primary, the main principles in play are natural selection and random variations, whether by mutations or genetic drift by chance. The Neo-Darwinian theory of evolution is widely accepted. It has been questioned, however, whether the two principles of random variation and natural selection are able to provide sufficient explanatory power. Some of the arguments against the theory are rather substantial and worth taking a closer look at in order to treat the question of the explanatory sufficiency of the Neo-Darwinian understanding. Often the objections have been presented in the context of a struggle with religious political overtones. That is, the objections are aimed at weakening the support for the biological evolutionary view and instead strengthening a more religiously oriented or less naturalistic, perhaps even creationist view. It seems trench warfare, with both sides holding fast to their respective views and agendas. Unfortunately, this means that the arguments, even though they may be valid, are often dismissed almost outright, or at least met with considerable tendentious prejudgments or agendas, as it seems acknowledging weaknesses in one's own view is seen as giving in to the other side, providing it with ammunition against one's own side. Some of the objections against the Neo-Darwinian theory of evolution do, however, seem to have merit. I'll briefly discuss them, focusing on the substance of the arguments and not who have raised them. After all, while the motives behind an argument might sometimes matter for its evaluation in certain practical contexts, in general it seems better to evaluate an argument based on its strength rather than the identity of its presenter. So, are the two fundamental principles of random variation and natural selection sufficient to adequately explain all the changes happening throughout the evolution of life? When it comes to the smaller steps of evolution, it is generally acknowledged that they are. The problem arises when it comes to the bigger steps or leaps. The evolution of sex is difficult to explain, for example, as it is not obvious that the advantages of sexual reproduction outweigh those of asexual reproduction. However, research is currently being done on this and hypotheses have been proposed, and it is not unreasonable to assume that a satisfactory explanation will be found. Other evolutionary steps seem more difficult to explain. For example, the evolution of the wing or of the eye. In both cases, an only partially developed trait seems to offer no particular advantage, perhaps even reducing fitness in the case of the wing. Only when the trait is fully developed does the fitness benefit become apparent. It has been counter-argued that it might not always be a matter of adaptation of traits directly through natural selection. Instead of adaptation, exaptation is suggested. Perhaps a trait was produced by natural selection for a function other than the one it currently performs, and was only later used for its current function. For example, feathers might have originally arisen as a means for insulation and were only later developed for flight. While speculative exaptation might help make sense of the steps in question. There are other evolutionary steps that seem more difficult to explain, however, not least at the biochemical level. It has been argued that what has been termed irreducibly complex systems, that is, systems, in this case biological features, where the removal of any one of its interacting parts causes the system to cease functioning, offer a particular challenge for the theory of evolution. Such a system, it is argued, cannot be produced by slight modifications of a precursor system, and thus cannot be explained by Neo-Darwinian evolutionary selection. Instead, the system would have to appear as an integrated unit in one go, which seems extremely improbable. One example is the transition from the primitive anaerobic cell to the more advanced aerobic cell that uses oxygen for its energy production. Here, the mechanics of random variation and natural selection seem insufficient to explain the transition. It is a huge shift with no intermediate steps possible, it seems. In the case of the evolution of the cell, 20 enzymes must be changed to make the jump from anaerobic to aerobic. An enzyme consists of a chain of amino acids. The probability that the amino acids of even a small enzyme is correctly composed if placed randomly is in the magnitude of 1 out of 10 to the 130th power. This is an almost inconceivably high number. Trillions of times the number of atoms in the entire universe. So the probability that this should happen purely at random is in effect 0. And moreover, this extraordinarily improbable variation must have happened not only once, but to each of the 20 enzymes in the anaerobic cell in order for it to change to an aerobic cell. And natural selection, which would otherwise guide the random evolution, does not seem to be able to play any role here, since a cell with only 1 or even 19 correctly mutated enzymes would not be at any advantage. Other examples of extremely improbable occurrences include, but are not limited to, the formation of the enzymes that govern the coagulation of the blood, the emergence of the first simple cell, the prokaryotic cell, and the complex eukaryotic cell, the presence of related species with different chromosome numbers, and the composition of DNA. The anthropic principle that every claim must necessarily be in accordance with the fact that man exists in order for it to be ontologically true might be presented as a counter-argument. Obviously, the present situation is what it is, including that man exists, regardless of how low the probability of this might be. While it is, of course, true that the situation is what it is, regardless of how improbable it is, it seems to be a rather peculiar explanation, as one philosopher has put it. If I ask for an explanation of the fact that the air pressure in the transcontinental jet is close to that at sea level, it's no answer to point out that if it weren't, I'd be dead. Another counter-argument to the irreducible complex systems objection is that natural selection is not a matter of whether the parts now in place could not be removed without the collapse of the biological or biochemical system, but whether they could have been put in place by natural selection in the first place. It could be imagined that a biochemical sequential process with several stages, with each new or added part supporting different processes, but where the processes link up at some point and start functioning independently, and the original sequence, no longer needed, being removed by natural selection, was the cause of such, at the end point, irreducible complex systems. That is, that the irreducible complex systems are evolved not by adaptation, but by a form of exaptation. That kind of evolutionary process has indeed been found at the biochemical level. For example, the so-called Krebs cycle, the complex process that allows energy from food to be converted into a form usable by the cells, a process for which nearly a dozen enzymes in the cell mitochondria are required. Until the discovery that exaptation apparently explained this biochemical cycle, this process was considered particularly difficult to explain in terms of natural selection, and was thus thought to pose a challenge to the Neo-Darwinian view. Hence, the argument basically holds that the cases presented against the Neo-Darwinian theory may not be explainable by the theory at the moment, but at a later time they might be. It's difficult to assess the evolutionary unlikeliness of the various biochemical processes. There does seem to be a difference, however, between new processes evolving within the cell, each providing fitness advantages, and these processes then being co-opted for a new end, and the transition from the anaerobic to the aerobic cell, where there seems to be no room for intermediary fitness advantageous processes. This is because anaerobic versus aerobic is simply a case of either or. Either the cell can break down sugars that generate energy in the absence of oxygen, the anaerobic cell, or it can do it relying on oxygen, the aerobic cell. In this case, exaptation seems much more unlikely. Neither does genetic drift seem able to solve the problem in an adequate way. Even if it is accepted that changes at the molecular level were not due to natural selections, but were neutral, caused by random genetic drift, this doesn't seem to solve the improbability issue. So there's no conclusive answer to the question of irreducible complex systems. When it comes down to it, it is a matter of whether one has faith in that they can be explained by, for example, exaptation in the future, or whether the evolutionary steps seem too improbable to have occurred in this way. In any case, the presence of biological and biochemical systems that apparently are unexplainable by natural selection alone has not been adequately explained within the frame of Neo-Darwinian evolution, and thus pose a rather substantial challenge to this view. In addition, it seems that the expectation of genetic research that DNA would explain inheritance has not been met. Instead, a missing heritability problem is present, where the expected DNA origins for heritage is far from found. DNA was viewed as the blueprint of life, and thus the evolutionary continuity between generations was expected to be explained in detail by genetic explanations. But despite comprehensive research, that has not been the case. That is, DNA seems to be a much less adequate explanatory factor than assumed, weakening the idea that inheriting fitness-enhancing traits through DNA. Another counter-argument notes that the fact that Neo-Darwinian biology has not yet had all the details clarified does not undermine it, since due to the enormous time span and relatively limited number of fossils, the theory cannot be expected to shed light on every concrete development, in particular when it comes to biochemical processes which do not leave fossils. It is unreasonable, on this view, to expect that all the details of evolution can be mapped and verified since the beginning of life on the planet. This is a reasonable point. However, it does not seem to solve the problem of evolutionary leaps that seem unreasonable, as it were, or extremely unlikely to happen to such an extraordinarily improbable degree. Philosophical objections to the Neo-Darwinian view have also been presented. Among them are objections directed more specifically at a materialist interpretation of evolution. This includes the claim that such an interpretation is inconsistent with a naturalized epistemology, meaning in this case that the obtaining of knowledge and facts must be understood within a framework of Neo-Darwinian evolution. It is thus argued that the Neo-Darwinian evolutionary mechanisms, which in a materialist naturalistic view must necessarily be the grounding principles of evolutionary development in general, and thus also explain the development of the human brain in particular, do not constitute a likely explanation for the brain creating more true ideas than false ones, regarding the laws of logic, for example. It is fitness with regard to survival and reproduction rather than truth that is decisive. And thus, while it is possible that human cognitive abilities, not least reason, actually can be trusted, there is not as strong a reason to do so as is usually assumed, including when reason is used to correct other perception judged to be false. That is, the mechanisms for the formation of beliefs which provide a fitness advantage in a concrete context of daily struggle for survival cannot justify any high degree of confidence in the construction of theoretical explanations of the world as a whole, and Neo-Darwinian evolutionary and reductive naturalistic conceptions are therefore not mutually consistent, it is argued. The former implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the latter, the scientific worldview, on which the former, the Neo-Darwinian view, itself depends. It then becomes very difficult to defend moral realism and objective value. How can some moral actions be considered ethically better than others in an absolute sense? if we don't have access to truth about reality, but merely to points of view that are advantageous in terms of fitness. In general, altruistic ethics provides somewhat of a challenge for the Neo-Darwinian view. Limited or in-group altruism has been explained by reciprocal altruism, a self-serving altruism in a sense. When the individual exercises altruistic behavior, a corresponding behavior is received from other members of the group. However, true or actual unselfish altruism, especially in its more definitive variants such as absolutely universal love and kindness, seems hard to explain by such a principle of reciprocal altruism. Another objection concerns the problem of explaining the emergence of reproducing organisms, the origin of life, and along these lines the emergence of consciousness, since it is argued reductionist materialism is unable to explain consciousness, much less the subjective individual point of view. The theory of evolution, as is usually understood, does not explain the emergence of this consciousness or of other phenomena that are not physically reducible. And even if the usual Neo-Darwinian evolutionary thinking is followed, explanations of the emergence of reason and the higher cognitive abilities from the ordinary consciousness possessed by animals seems to be merely speculative. Random variation, natural selection do not seem, it is argued, to be sufficient to explain the emergence of consciousness. The first blip of feeling that had to appear in an organism which until then was without consciousness does not seem in itself to constitute any fitness advantage. And even if it was not a question of mere sensation or feeling as such, but of sensation related to the environment, allowing the organism to take advantageous actions based on external stimuli, it seems that a selection-driven evolution could very well favor organisms with mechanical rather than consciousness-based reactions to such stimuli. They would, it seems, have been at least as suitable for survival through such differentiated behavior as the first organisms with a rudimentary ability to experience. While most organisms such as bacteria don't have consciousness, presumably, at least humans and higher animals do, and it is thus not clear why it was not this mechanical type of organism that was further developed through natural selections in the first place, rather than organisms with incipient consciousness. Such extremely rudimentary consciousness, a first blip of feeling, would suggest a feeling of what it is like to be that organism, but without any capacity to act consciously to change the nature of that experience. This does not in itself seem to constitute a selective advantage. A follow-up problem is to explain the development of the higher cognitive abilities of consciousness, not least reason and the ability to think abstractly. Abstract reasoning, it has been suggested based on archaeological records, was in place 60,000 years ago. It is not obvious, however, it is argued that such advanced cognitive abilities, at the level of being able to discover and understand the laws of physics and chemistry, have survival value in prehistoric everyday life. The main counter-argument against these objections seems to be that they are too little informed by contemporary writings on evolutionary theory. While this is a fair objection, the latest research should indeed be considered in any debate, and while there does seem to be some advances on understanding certain chemical processes that might turn out to lead to organic life proper, there are no results that point toward a solution to the question of the appearance of consciousness or the problem of explaining rationality within a Neo-Darwinian context. Thus, the counter-argument that contemporary thought is not taken sufficiently into account doesn't really reach the core of the objections. And they, as well, therefore seem to constitute another group of substantial arguments against the Neo-Darwinian theory of evolution, questioning its explanatory power. On a scientific theoretical note, the Neo-Darwinian theory of evolution is primarily supported through retrospective empirical verification, in the sense that the answer is already given beforehand and explanations based on available empirical observations are then suggested afterwards. The traits of a species are given and explanations for the evolution to those traits are then suggested based on fossils and other remains. This makes the suggested explanations difficult to falsify. It is only to a limited degree possible to set up prospective evolutionary studies within falsifiable hypotheses, and this weakens the Neo-Darwinian theory of evolution somewhat in a scientific theoretical sense. The debate on the Neo-Darwinian theory of evolution is comprehensive and covers many more topics than the ones touched upon in this video, such as at which level the selection happens, genes, individuals, groups, population, species, or regarding order versus chaos. Can evolution bring order out of chaos, or perhaps order is merely apparent, and many more. They are outside the scope of this video, however. Several important views and arguments have been presented already, deemed sufficient to show that regarding the question of whether the principles of random variation and natural selection constitute a sufficient explanation of biochemical and biological evolution, it seems that although the Neo-Darwinian theory of evolution stands quite strong, partly on the basis of extensive supporting empirical findings, and partly due to a general acceptance of materialistic naturalism, the criticisms that have been advanced against this theory, including those pointing out unresolved questions in the Neo-Darwinian model, like the occurrence of what has been interpreted as discontinuity in the evolutionary process, do show considerable promise. That is, the explanatory power of the theory seems lesser than what is perhaps often assumed. The theory has a broad empirical grounding, and it is possible that the currently unresolved issues will be resolved in the future. On the other hand, the, after all, non-negligible objections against the theory mean that it doesn't seem unlikely that the theory will be subject to adjustments in the future, whether of a minor or major character. Indeed, it seems possible that the theory itself, as an adequate explanation of the evolutionary history of life and the evolution of man, turns out to be insufficient. That is the case especially if metaphysical materialism, the view that the only thing that exists independently is the physical, is not taken as a fixed premise. In a sense, the Neo-Darwinian theory of evolution can be seen as a materialist interpretation of the empirical data. Non-materialist interpretations are possible, perhaps even leading to theories that show greater explanatory power. Thus, the question of whether the Neo-Darwinian theory of evolution displays sufficient explanatory power is linked to the metaphysical question of the nature of reality. If the Neo-Darwinian theory is accepted, this indirectly supports a materialist understanding, since the evolution of life can then be explained within a materialist framework. And conversely, if the theory is substantially questioned, that is, if the objections against it are seen as valid, this weakens a metaphysical premise of materialism, perhaps opening up the field for other perspectives on the nature of reality. Thanks.